Hi, everyone. Welcome once again. Appreciate your being here, taking the time to watch my videos. Um, After that lengthy introduction to scholarship in Buddhism, I just want to say one thing briefly about scholarship as a reminder. Um, I think of scholarship in two different realms when it comes to Buddhism. There's a tremendous amount of scholarship inside and outside of Buddhism, simply about the translations. Um, I'm going to put a link on my webpage where I have lots of links on the threefoldlotus.com/home/home.htm. And you can get there from the initial page, threefoldlotus.com. Just look for core study materials. I found an out-of-print book by a professor from Harvard, written in the late 19th century, 1870. Anyway, um, it was a marvelous writing, long essay, if you will, on the history of Nichiren uh, and the entire history, um, and a good synopsis, I think is the best word, for Nichiren Buddhism. I shouldn't call it Nichiren Buddhism, but that's the common term. That's misleading though, because the Buddhism that we practice is all Shakyamuni's teaching. So let's get that out of the way. We practice nearly 3,000-year-old teaching. Um, all the hoopla and discrimination in the teachings, the sects, if you will, is a result of an internal scholarship about the translations, the various translations of uh, a great many sermons that Shakyamuni delivered throughout his about 58 years of teaching. You can imagine almost 60 years of every day doing nothing but talking about Buddhism. His sermons were a form of teaching that had a lot of repetition in them because they were spread verbally. Nobody was writing anything down at the time. But those disciples who followed Shakyamuni and were some left him halfway through, some joined up halfway through his teaching years. But especially as you approach the end of his life, you can imagine there were a lot of disciples of varying order, living in different areas of India. And the challenge was because Buddha made this a teaching for everyone, which was pretty radical at that time. And even to this day, we know India has a caste structure. And I talked about that already, so I'm not going to go at length into it. But the bottom line is, most of the common spoken language is Pali. The common higher caste, the knowledge caste, the people who are responsible for transmitting writing and classic discourse and written language, were the Brahmin class, a caste, I should say. Um, in this country, we have a caste system, but it's all based on money. Um, So if you were of a certain caste in India, and I think I talked about this exhaustively too, you weren't even allowed to learn stuff. Um, anyway, long story short, I say all this because it took hundreds of years to translate these sermons, not only in Pali and Sanskrit, but then to other India today has 126 official languages. I don't know if you can wrap your head around that. But if you could imagine a different language for every state in the United States, you'd have to know a heck of a lot of languages in order to just traverse the country. Um, and each one of those needed their translation to be not only theoretical but accurate. I mean, Buddhism desires and requires a great deal of accuracy in how you say things. Um, Buddhism is a method, and it's very much like the scientific method of increasing our mind's perception. It's a training manual, if you will, for us to open up greater percentage of our mind to understand what's really going on in the universe, um, and understand the real depth of the life process. So it's work. It's not just something you do as a ritual to pass the time. It's actual study and practice. And so a great deal of scholarship, you can imagine, goes on to this day, reading Chinese transcripts, Indian transcripts of different variety, Burmese transcripts, so on and so forth. A lot of Chinese. When Buddhism finally got across the Himalayas or went underneath through Sri Lanka and so forth in southern China, um, a lot of work was done for translation. And just to give you an example, and I mentioned this before too, Chinese is a very complex language, but India, Sanskrit, and Pali had concepts in them that Chinese didn't have any characters for. So they had to actually invent new words, new characters to encompass the thoughts and the ideas correctly. They didn't just patch together a few other words. If they didn't have a word for car, they didn't say, horse cart without horse, no one pushing. That could have led you astray in many, many ways. So they had to invent a word for car, which meant that they also had to have a long-winded description of what that is, so the Chinese people knew when they read the word and then they looked at the definition, oh, and they could see, a new concept. So these kind of things made it take a long time to go through translations. There were certain scholars and experts along the way who did a magnificent job. You could trace their different versions as they cleaned them up and maybe found, uh, in the common vernacular where something didn't translate well, and they went back and retranslated it. So, hundreds and hundreds of scholars dedicated their lives to correctly transmit what the Buddha actually, or Shakyamuni actually said. So there's that scholarship, and you can find lots of discourse all over the place on that, from within the Buddhist order and the different sects and arguments within the different sects, and without outside of the Buddhist order, from people whose names escape me right now. But the point I want to make there is that uh, much of the scholarship coming to the West was done by people, and if you read this when I put it online, it's a great story, but keep in mind that this guy was he was working with another professor at Harvard, and the thing that's interesting about this essay is that it was put together by a uh, a Japanese uh, priest or monk. There again, we always hear the word priest. That's a Western term. They're monks. And I catch myself because I've been educated by a lot of that stuff that's misworded. But anyway, the point being is that all of the translations that were going on into the Western world, into English, around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, they were being done by scholars who were either directly related to or tangentially related to Christian missionary work. And it was in their best interest, even though they were scholars and they tried their best to interpret these words. Their interpretations had an agenda, and their agenda was to more or less minimize the effectiveness of Buddhism, the method, and B, to westernize it. And by that I mean to give the reader the impression that the rhetoric of Christianity was already built in and therefore superior to Buddhism, so that in one fell swoop they enforced the Christian rhetoric while weakening the Buddhist rhetoric. And I take that very seriously. And I find it to be an integral to my mission as an abbot now of the Threefold Lotus Kuan. And I'm rewriting a lot of treatises and books with a more true, as best as I can, transcription of what is meant in the Buddhist sutras. I think it's important. We're living in a time now where we have so much information barraging everyone, and people having limited attention spans, that if they hear a rhetorical word that they're used to associating with something, they don't even bother to question it. They just accept it and move on, and unknowingly uh, completely are baffled and do not understand the Buddhist method, and losing a great opportunity to clarify their minds as a result. So this is, I would call it actually an enemy of Buddhism, to read a lot of this great scholarship. And it's very unfortunate because there's tremendous amounts of research out there. At the same time, I want to encourage you to research on your own. But please, please, please be aware that words like faith and um, so many others, they really have nothing to do with Buddhist thought and Buddhist method. Um, Buddhism is strictly based on observation and tangible, like I said, scientific repetition and reproducibility. So that's why Buddhists will talk about actual proof, because the actual proof in Buddhism as a method is actualization that you witness in your own life. It's not like putting chocolate into milk and making chocolate milk. It's things that happen in your mind, in your perceptive ability, that you become aware of, and they're undeniable. You know you went through something. You know that you know something more deeply. Your behavior changes. These are real things. Um, People tend to want to assign mysticism to things like that, but there's no mysticism in Buddhism. Although I have to say, when Buddha first started having his sermons, he tried to speak without mysticism and explain what things were like once you awakened your Buddha nature. And he scared a lot of people because he was talking to the average everyday caste community, people who were farmers or reshoeing horses for their whole life. That was it. They were born into it. That's all they could ever become. And he was telling them they could achieve these higher life conditions, and they were like, "This is a heretic. This guy's going to get us in trouble." He only taught that way for 21 days before he pulled back and realized, um, meditated on it, and saw the wisdom in teaching people in stages. And there were 5 of those stages. Okay, I'm repeating all of this because we're going to get into this from the standpoint of Nichiren's scholarship, somebody within the Buddhist community. And I want to, before I say this, I want to answer that the scholarship, I said there were 2 types. I apologize. I've been talking about scholarship within uh, the Buddhist order and outside the Buddhist order about the translations. But there's also scholarship about what is the right path to follow. Because, uh, and as you'll see as I'll read this, uh, because it took so much time to translate everything, there were people's entire lifetimes uh, spent uh, reading and practicing the first and second period, and up to the third period. There's 5 periods of teaching. Up to the third period, that transmitted all over the southern China and into, what was then Sri Lanka, and what is it called today? Anyway, um, look it up. um, and those people and their children, that's all they ever heard of Buddhism before they passed away. And so there were firmly entrenched schools after 100 years. There were firmly entrenched temples and schools about Buddhism, who basically treated what they had received as all of Buddha's teachings. So you'll hear the words Hinayana or Theravada or Tripitaka, three, saying the first 3 periods of his teaching, and still very staunch, very adamant practitioners of those first teachings, as though they are all of the teachings of Buddha and they don't need to know anymore. Well, I'll talk about that. I'm going to read directly from a treatise that Nichiren wrote that addresses that problem. Um, a lot of people have asked me over my almost 30 years of study, why Nichiren Buddhism? Again, not Nichiren Buddhism. We can call it, let's have an understanding. Buddhism is Shakyamuni. He's the only person who attained his enlightenment as a human being on earth and became enlightened. Buddha is, for lack of a better word, a life condition or a condition of being. Um, Shakyamuni, the man's name, is the teachings that we learn and practice. When we talk about scholarship, though, we will drop names like Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu and Kumarajiva and Tendai and Chiyi, Dengyo, Saicho, Miaolo, and Nichiren. These are the great religious scholars who spent their entire life from the age of 12 or sometimes even earlier, um, studying at different temples throughout China and India, all of the um, sermons, the writings that are translations of the sermons of Shakyamuni, and taking responsibility for correcting the regionalisms that entered into it. And this just happens over time, right? Um, People like to hold on to some beliefs they had from Taoism, for instance, or Confucianism, or in India, Jainism, and or the idea. I mean, India was very pummeled with Christianity, and Brahmanism by that time is really Hinduism, had turned into such an esoteric religion where I mean, from cows to elephants to all kinds of gods and deities and everything else, they were very easy to succumb to the Christian crusaders. Um, and Buddhism was even run out of India several times. So anyway, the point being uh, that there was always this very strong backbone of scholarship in Buddhist history, and there always arose. They had, regular annual debates amongst several schools, and boy, you had to know your stuff. And from one quoting one sermon to another sermon of there's so many of them. The Buddhism uses, and they like to use numbers in this way in Buddhism. They call them the 84,000 teachings. Not because there are 84,000 teachings. There may be more than that. The point is, there's such a great number that in order to be a scholar and really know what this practice is about, you have to be incredibly well read. And if you spent your whole life uh, entering a debate, uh, educated from one school, eh, that debate wouldn't be very important. That's what it would end up happening, is that nobody would really respect your opinion. Nichiren was one of those, our most recent internal scholar, um, who traveled all over China, Japan, India, Korea, um, all in search of every single document he could find so that he could weigh them and find other scholars and identify their work and work with their work. Um, Scholars have been doing this all the way back 3,000 years to Shakyamuni himself. Um, so, with that, let's get started. Um, the title of the sutra is, conveniently enough, Errors of the Eight Schools. Now, Nichiren wrote this at his time in the 13th century, mid 1200s. I may actually have the date at the end of this. And I don't know if we'll get through all of this in this video. I may have to continue in a second, but let's get started. So, these are Nichiren's words now. Volume 9 of the annotations on the words and phrases of the Lotus Sutra states, if the provisional has not yet been opened up and the true revealed, then the Dharma body and the reward body are not present in the provisional Buddha. But if the true has been already revealed, then all three bodies are present in both the true Buddha and the provisional Buddha. So, there's a bunch of terms I already have to explain, right? When he quotes the annotations on the words and phrases of the Lotus Sutra, he's actually using Tendai's teachings, which, if you know any of the history of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism specifically, which, as I said earlier, Theravada, Hinayana, Tripitaka, that's all the first three periods. If you don't study math all the way to the end, you can't say that you know math. You know subtraction and addition. You know trigonometry, or you know geometry, or you may know algebra. But knowing those doesn't qualify you to tackle calculus unless you spend some time studying it, right? Just like you can't automatically know quantum except in, quirky little examples. You can't truly understand it unless you have a pretty good math background. So, unless you study all 5 periods of Buddha's teachings, you can't have a complete picture. It was only in the 8 final years of Buddha's life, or Shakyamuni's life, that he taught the Lotus Sutra. And in the Lotus Sutra, the preamble to the Lotus Sutra says, look, for the 40 years and more, or 50 years and more, I can't remember what it said now, I have not taught the complete truth. Not because I've been lying to you, but because you haven't been ready for it. And now, with the Lotus Sutra, I will give you the absolute ultimate teaching. So, we're not inventing this. This is what Shakyamuni said. So it baffles me, actually, quite honestly, how there are so many sects of the Hinayana still extant in countries, adamantly clinging to the idea that they have the whole teaching. I could understand that, maybe 1,000 years ago, maybe even 500 years ago. But in the age we live in today, where everybody's got a cell phone and internet and everything, even in Burma, for them to not accept Mahayana teachings, it baffles me. They're actually behaving contrary to Buddhism. So anyway, back to Nichiren, definitely Mahayana Buddhist. Mahayana Buddhism started before Qi, but Qi in the 6th century in China took on the task of putting all of these teachings in order, and demonstrating how they were cumulative, and made an entire index catalog of all of Buddha's teachings. That's 84,000 teachings, right? And he wrote many treatises and teachings when he came to the awakening, his enlightenment of the Lotus Sutra being the ultimate teachings. And so he had to back that claim up, because he was going to have to debate it, right, with other scholars and other abbots and even some government officials. So through his scholarship, Nagarjuna's scholarship, which happened around the 1st century, clearing up things. Nagarjuna was the first to really put a nail in this misconception of an eternal soul, or an eternal entity or body or bag of whatever. And he did it not by saying, I, Nagarjuna, say this. Again, all of scholarship is to go back and debate and read accurately what the Buddha himself said. And it's very obvious once somebody like Nagarjuna makes the argument and debates it, and you can read Nagarjuna on your own. There is no such thing as an eternal anything, let alone an eternal soul. It's one of the primary concepts of Buddha's methodology, is that the concept of impermanence. Absolutely nothing is in and of itself an entity of its own whatever. There's nothing permanent, except perhaps energy. But in what form, we'll discuss that later. All right, so this is one of the major writings of Chi or Tendai, is the annotations on the words and phrases of the Lotus Sutra. And then he talks about the provisional versus the revealed. And what he's talking about there is that, again, in the first periods of Shakyamuni's teachings, Buddha was referred to as a man, was referred to as that was his name, Buddha. Was referred to as a human being, the Buddha. But in his latter teachings, and specifically in the Lotus Sutra, was the only sutra where in the second half of the Lotus Sutra, he revealed in the 16th chapter, specifically titled Myoho Renge Kyo, the lifespan of the Tathagata, that he had been born a human and reached his enlightenment or awakening at the age of 30 as a provisional means of teaching human beings that they could attain the Buddha awakened state. So again, Buddha is an awakened condition of the mind. But in the earlier teachings, it was taught that Buddha was something you could never achieve in this life, that it was a goal that you had at some point in multiple rebirths. And we'll get to rebirths, because that's so almost always misinterpreted as reincarnation, but it's not. We live moment to moment, and each moment is a birth and a rebirth and a rebirth and a rebirth until we peter out and we no longer have rebirth, which in a way, I don't want to confuse you. Anyway, so the historical Buddha you'll hear referred to a lot in scholarship outside of Buddhism, because that's how they can say, well, if we have a historical point in time where we can say that guy right there, that was the Buddha, then we know the historical Buddha is the provisional Buddha. Okay, and we're going to hit this again, but in a different way. So follow me on this. That's the provisional Buddha, because he's our living example of how to exercise this method. The revealed Buddha is when you finally get to the teachings where you find out, oh, dude, you're not Buddha. Buddha is just the way your mind works. Oh, can I do that too? Yes, you can do that too. In fact, it's already there. You simply need to awaken expand that perceptive mind. You've been told your whole life we use 10% of our minds. Now we're talking about the super plasticity of our neuroplasticity in our minds. We can use much more of our minds. This is a training method to enable you to do that. And the supposition is that if you practice this well and use this method to open up your mind and use more and more of it, at one point you will become self-aware, really self-aware. And that's when nothing will influence you anymore. You won't have emotional outbursts. You will see everything with equanimity. You'll kind of have a calm smile about you all the time because nothing will penetrate your state of being. You'll be completely removed from this veiled and corrupt understanding of what's really going on, only due to your lack of proper perception. That's the whole nutball right there. Your lack of ability to perceive correctly what's going on is what gives you the illusion that you have an ego, a self, a real self, which is baloney. And that ego, that real self, is what attaches itself emotionally and willfully to everything. We have very powerful desires and cravings. That's why Buddhism calls them cravings, because they're so strong. Things like sex. I mean, do I need to discuss how deep those cravings go? I'm not just talking about your favorite TV show, although that's included too. All of that is a result of what Buddha called habit energy. That habit energy, as I've discussed in other videos, is karma. And it just continuously wants to be, it wants to instantiate, it wants to be in it. But all the while, we're in something much, much larger, and we don't have to want it. It just is the way everything is. But we can't stop our monkey minds from thinking. We think ourselves to death, which is why we entertain ourselves to death. That's just the fallout of thinking all the time. We constantly want something to solve, something to have, something to play with, something other. And that's the crux of the matter, is we keep seeing ourselves as separate from everything else. Once you expand your mind enough to conceive of everything as the same thing, then all of that construct, all of that mess, all of that thinking, it just has no reason to be anymore. It's hard to even think of what being in that mind state could be. So, that's just the first paragraph. This may take a while. Volume 9 of the Words and Phrases of the Lotus Sutra says, quote, "The Buddha constantly possesses the three bodies throughout the three existences, but in the various teachings other than the Lotus Sutra, he kept this secret and did not transmit it." The three bodies are the Dharma body, the reward body, and the manifested body. As Buddha, you could say he experienced the Dharma body. He had the innate reward body and instantiated in physical as a bodhisattva or Buddha as the manifested body. In living beings, you can translate those things, the Dharma body, as being our innate Buddha nature. A lot of times people talk about Dharma meaning the teachings. That's not quite accurate. It's not completely wrong, but if you're studying a method, but you don't know or have not experienced it yet, or you haven't even come close yet, you're still slogging along, studying, getting little insights and so forth. After you get enough insights, your level of understanding will grow. And at some point in that growth, you'll start to see the goal. Okay, when I chant or when I meditate, especially when I'm doing Gongyo, for those of you doing Gongyo, when you read the meditations or prayers, whatever book you're reading, I call them meditations because, again, prayer is a suggestive term of desire from something else. And there's nothing like that in Buddhism. What we try to instantiate in our meditations and ourselves is a completely clear mind that perceives our true nature. It's in our minds. It's ourselves that we're working on, our own minds, not yours, his, my mother's. Okay, will affect them, but that's not my goal. My goal is to clear this one up so that all of those others benefit from it. That's the bodhisattva path. But just to simplify this for you, for me, when I read the meditations, especially on the one saying that I'm going to get rid of my karma, I take a moment and close my eyes and I just let myself breathe. I don't try to count it or breathe. Just be aware that you're breathing and let it breathe, relaxed. And I try to focus my mind. First of all, you have to get to a point where you can stop thinking, which is hard to achieve. And I don't achieve it all the time, but just trying is an achievement. Okay. When you can stop your mind from thinking, you almost have to replace that, and I know I do. The idea of stopping thinking is another idea, so you can't get out of the loop. You get attached. You don't want to be attached to thinking, so you think about not thinking, and what are you attached to then? Thinking about not thinking. So you just it's endless. So what I try to do is I try to find a point in the back of my eye, whatever that field is that we all see when we close our eyelids. We don't really see our eyelids, do we? It's just there's light permeating through our lids and we're getting little sensations in our neurons, but we can't really make stuff out. So in that little mess, I allow myself to feel just space and I look for quiescence. I look for energy that is so low and not volatile, not vibrating. I don't look for wavelengths. I don't look for any. I look for absolute quiescence, and just that force on my mind pushes thoughts away, out of my way. That's how it works for me, anyway. And maybe that's because I've been doing this so long. I don't know, but maybe it's something you try it. Maybe it'll work for you. This is a very individual practice. So I can't tell you definitely how I can just guide you. And that's what I'm trying to do here. So I will focus on, and sometimes I'll connect, sometimes it'll just sort of be like a TV snow, but it doesn't matter because the point is other thoughts fall away and I'm just kind of lost. When I'm not thinking about not thinking, I'm just kind of wandering. And when that moment happens, I know I'm looking in the right place. Um, every time I do that, even if it's for a second, when I open my eyes, I'm a different person. I'm far more relaxed and I'm far more open. And I feel it's like flipping a switch. So, to see that, it already exists there. So that's our innate Buddha nature. To to have the wisdom to perceive it. Now that's a weird word because wisdom implies thought, doesn't it? Um, I almost want to change that word, but it's Nichiren, so I'm not going to change it. Or maybe he never said wisdom, maybe he said something else. Um, but I would equate it more with awareness. Just when the light goes on, and you sometimes have you ever had the experience where you wake up and you can't quite make out where the heck you are? whether it's because you're at a friend's house or your aunt's house, or you just, you abused your body the night before and did too much drinking, whatever. You've probably experienced at least once opening up your eyes and going, oh, and then information starts filtering in. You go, oh, I'm here. I woke up in my own house and thought, uh, I didn't know where I was, simply because I was facing the opposite side of the bed that I thought I opened my eyes on, and the door was supposed to be. So it's very easy to confuse the human mind. Um, so that wisdom he's talking about is really when things gel and you get it, you start to become aware in order to, as I was saying earlier, in order to see that the Buddhist method is working and you're becoming more perceptive, you kind of have to have an awareness function to see your own perception changing, right? So that's what we're talking about. That happens only in the human mind. The Buddha condition doesn't need that because it's already there. That's a human thing. And then, in order to get that awareness, you have to perform, good deeds, or perform the eightfold path. And I talked about that, and I'll talk about it again, I promise, because I don't think I went into it that deeply. But I have some videos you can look at that'll have a lot of answers on that. Um, and this is how you develop your wisdom as well. But it shows you how to develop causationally, um, to awaken, um, the wisdom and the Buddha life condition. So these are the three bodies: the Dharma body, the reward body, and the manifest body. The manifest body is the one that takes actions in this phenomenal world. The reward body is using this manifested body in a way that produces positive karmic results, reward. And the Dharma body is when now you don't need any of that stuff, because your human life then becomes transcendent, because you can disconnect from the seventh and sixth mano consciousnesses, the mano vijnanas, the human mind, and enter the Buddha mind. Okay? And the Buddha mind doesn't have all these obstructions of desires, cravings, influences, none of that. It just is totally equanimous and perceives everything rightfully as it is occurring. It has no, best way I could describe it is to have no influences or prejudices or leanings, no desires. Hard to imagine being in that mind state, but that's something maybe to meditate on as well, to bring you to that place. Okay, the Buddha nature of all living beings. Again, back to Nichiren. Presence or absence of the Buddha nature is not discussed in the early teachings of the first three periods, the Hinayana, the Theravada, the Tripitaka. It's not discussed. That's an error. The Flower Garland Sutra, the first teaching, Correct and Equal, the Wisdom Sutra, and the Mahavajrayana Sutras teach that living beings from the beginning possess an innate Buddha nature, but not the wisdom to perceive it or good deeds to develop this wisdom. So those don't have um, the three bodies. And again, just to help you understand that last paragraph, he's the first periods of his teachings. Um, you may or may not know that by the time we get into Mahayana and we develop Mahayana, his first Mahayana had only 8 consciousnesses. It wasn't until latter Mahayana, certainly by the Lotus Sutra, that we had an understanding of 9 consciousnesses. And the ninth being the Amala consciousness, which is the Buddha mind, the quiescent energy mind. Okay. Um, the earlier teachings You, as a human, you would never be able to attain that Buddha state. You would never be able to even achieve the Bodhisattva state, which is basically a Buddha who is in human form to facilitate other people's direction uh, in the method to become awakened to their Buddha life, mind. The highest you could achieve was Arhat. And an Arhat was somebody who was like the Shravakas from the world of learning, and the Pratyeka Buddhas, or just prior to Pratyeka Buddha, that area of realization where Arhats were pretty amazingly developed humans, but the worlds of Bodhisattva and Buddhahood were not available to them. That would have to happen somewhere else. And That's an incomplete method. That's an incomplete teaching. But because he was talking to people of almost 3,000 years ago, as I explained with caste system and everything else, the things he was teaching were pretty radical. Imagine, for instance, this is something that's in the news today, has been for I don't know how long. He taught in the Lotus Sutra, in the ultimate later teachings, that, and it may have been the Lotus Sutra that introduced this, that women could attain Buddhahood. Now, think about this. You're working, you've become a Buddhist from a couple hundred years of Hinayana practice, and you're working hard to be an Arhat, a very difficult thing in its own. And then somebody comes and shows you in a Mahayana teaching, saying, "Look at here, it says your sister can become a Buddha." Two stages of development beyond what you can ever achieve as an arhat, as a human being, but your sister can be one? What? Yeah, there's a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance on this teaching. All right. Today we read it and we go, well, yeah, that makes sense. You know, why couldn't a girl get away? But 3,000 years ago, I mean, you can go to the Middle East today and people will want to beat you up for saying, okay. So, this was a radical teaching. Still is to me, in many ways. But anyway, it was the Lotus Sutra that teaches that all living beings from the beginning possess all three inherent potentials of the Buddha nature. Um, Volume 10 of Words and Phrases states, quote, "The innate Buddhahood, the proper nature of the Dharma body, um, pervades both the original state of living beings and their temporary manifestation. The seeds of the wisdom to perceive it and of the good deeds to develop this wisdom are also present in the original state. They are not acquired for the first time at a later stage." In other words, Buddhahood is not something we need to develop. Buddhahood is something we need to awaken to. I almost said discover, but it's very difficult to keep the idea of duality out of the language of Buddhism, unless that's what it's talking about. So, and this is what Nichiren is saying. Before the Lotus Sutra, all the other sutras, um, there was no direct path and no fundamental understanding that all of the wisdom, the ability to achieve the wisdom, and the transcendent state of Buddhahood were available to you as a human. It wasn't until the Lotus Sutra that he made it abundantly clear that you're already walking around in and of it. So once again, I want to talk to those people who are saying, why the Lotus Sutra? Why is that so superior? Why is Mahayana superior? It's this kind of logic from a Buddhist scholar that will pull from, and he's going to get into specific other schools of his day and take them apart for these reasons. He's just setting you up right now, showing you the basic fundamental problems with the other sects that they don't practice correctly. The second volume of the Lotus Sutra states, "But now this threefold world is all my domain, and living beings in it are all my children. And now this place is beset by many pains and trials, and I am the only person who can rescue and protect others." This is the Buddha talking. Now remember, Buddha is a life condition. He's not owning this just as Shakyamuni, although a lot of people wanted to say it was him as Lord Buddha who was saying he could do this. What he was saying is, in the Buddha life condition, this is what you are. And what that translates to is three things you'll hear very often as you study this. The world honor one as sovereign and ruler of a nation. The three attributes they give a bodhisattva, or somebody who practices and acts as a votary of the Lotus Sutra. So not just for yourself, but for others. So bodhisattvas have the three qualities of sovereign, parent, and teacher. And this is how your heart, if you will, feels toward human life. You feel a responsibility to facilitate others' path. That's a teacher. You feel a deep, abiding concern for everyone's well-being. That's a parent. And furthermore, you extrapolate that caring out to how your whole community, your whole state, your whole country, the whole world, how people interact and how rules are made for acceptable interactions, and how there's a lot of corruption in. I'm talking about this in the age of Trump. Sorry, but on that level, you're more of less of a parent. You're expanding your parenthood to entire groups of people, and that's a sovereign. Okay, and a sovereign is a good term for that, rather than some kind of official title. And I think. Yeah, and the next thing we'll discuss is the lifespan chapter, where Buddha discusses the three bodies of the Buddha, and yeah, we start getting into some meat there. So I'm going to stop this tape at this juncture. I hope there's a bunch there for you to chew on and question. Please make comments under the video. Ask me questions. I had a question come up that I found today on my Google Plus page, because every time I put a video on the video page, it sends a message to Google Plus and to Twitter that I put a new video up. And so somebody asked me a question on Google Plus. That's fine. Sooner or later, I'm going to get to it. There are a lot of ways to send me questions. If you don't want to be on YouTube asking the question, you can ask on Google Plus, or you can email me directly at threefoldlotus at hotmail.com. Sorry. It's on the website. It's easy to find, and it's on the Facebook page as well. And you can ask me questions on the Facebook page. So, anyway, I'm enjoying this. This is refreshing my Buddhist practice, and I love it when I get input from you guys or questions from you guys, because I can answer you much more narrowly and directly to your exact question. Anyway, take good care. Myoho Renge Kyo. Thank you, friends. Bye now.